The chipped formica of the security console felt cold under Leo Maxwell's elbows. New Year's Eve at the Golden Mirage, a predictable symphony of desperation and manufactured joy. Glitter rained down from the colossal chandelier, catching the light and refracting it into 1,000 meaningless sparkles. The air thrummed with bass, the clinking of glasses, and the shrill laughter of people attempting to forget, or to forget something too and something. Leo adjusted the earpiece. The static of familiar comfort. Another year, another night spent watching other people chase oblivion. He scanned the casino floor, his gaze sweeping past the roulette wheels, the blackjack tables, the slot machines blinking like predatory eyes, the usual assortment of hopeful faces and practiced sharks tonight. They were all predators, each looking to take a piece of someone else's fleeting happiness. He'd spent enough time looking into the eyes of predators to recognize the scent. The scent was metallic, like old blood. He swirled the lukewarm coffee in his mug, a pathetic attempt to ward off the chill that settled deep in his bones. A chill that had nothing to do with the casino's aggressively efficient air conditioning. It was a December chill, a November chill, a chill that had followed him since Baltimore, since 40 her flicker of an image, unbidden. Rain slicking the cobblestones. The flashing blue and red, Sarah's face, pale and gone. He squeezed his eyes shut, the ghost of her perfume soon lilacs and something else. Something uniquely through and through Caesarea phantom pressure on his chest. He hadn't smelled lilac since, didn't think he ever wanted to. The case had been simple enough on the surface, missing person, wealthy businessman's daughter, turned into a labyrinth of lies, betrayals, and a darkness that clung to him still. He'd been so sure he was doing the right thing, so sure he could save her. He hadn't 3 years of static, of trying to scrub the images from the back of his eyelids. This job, the Golden Mirage, was supposed to be a refuge, a place where the stakes were low, the problems superficial, the violence contained. He'd traded investigations for observation, interrogation for maintaining order. A lateral move. His captain had called it a retreat, Leo had thought. "You all right, Leo?" Benny, the night manager, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with exhaustion, hovered beside him. "Just fine, Benny. Long night ahead." Benny nodded, his gaze sweeping the floor with a practiced eye. "Tell me about it. Place is already a zoo. Dresden's due any minute, and that'll really kick things off." Arthur Dresden, the name pricked at Leo's awareness. Local real estate mogul, rumored connections to less-than-savory individuals. A man who exuded power like heat from an engine. "He coming alone?" Leo asked, attempting a casual tone. "Alone with his personal security detail. 3 of them this time. Usually it is 2. Seems like he is anticipating trouble." Benny snorted. "Dresden civi trouble." Leo watched the main entrance. The revolving doors spun, disgorging a steady stream of revelers. Then they parted. Dresden, he wasn't what Leo expected. He'd imagined a hulking figure, a man built on intimidation. But Dresden was refined, tall, and lean, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. His face was lean, sharp angles, and a predatory stillness in his dark eyes. He moved with an unnerving grace, a controlled energy that demanded attention. The security detail fanned out around him, efficient and precise. Too precise, Leo thought. They moved like a unit, but there was something off. The man on Dresden's left, a thick-set individual with a shaved head, kept his hand a little too close to his inside jacket pocket. The woman on the right, her gaze constantly scanning the crowd, was subtly angling her body, creating an unnatural barrier between Dresden and the room. The lead, a former Special Forces operative named Kovar, maintained a stoic expression. But his eyes missed nothing. Kovar was good, very good. But even Kovar seemed distracted, a fraction of a second longer than necessary to assess a particular face, a slight hesitation before adjusting his position. Leo frowned. It wasn't obvious. Not to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Leo Maxwell, despite his self-imposed exile, hadn't lost his edge. Dresden paused at a high-stakes poker table, surveying the players with a cool detachment. A ripple of deference followed his gaze. Players straightened, adjusted their ties, attempted to look worthy. Dresden offered a curt nod and continued toward the casino's private lounge. "The Serpent's eye? Something bothering you, Leo?" Benny asked, leaning closer. "Just observing." The security detail feels overkill and a little sloppy. Benny shrugged. Dresden likes to make a statement, and those guys get paid well to look intimidating. Don't sweat it. Leo didn't sweat it, but he watched. He watched as Dresden entered the Serpent's eye, followed by Kovar and the two bodyguards. He watched the way Kovar's eyes continually swept the room, assessing threats. He watched the subtle tension in the bodyguard's shoulders. He watched, and a nagging feeling, a precursor to the dread he remembered so well, began to coil in his stomach. He focused on Dresden, tracking his movements on the security monitors. The man was a magnet, drawing attention, radiating an aura of power that demanded deference. He accepted a drink, a clear liquid in a crystal glass, and engaged in brief conversation with a cluster of equally well-dressed individuals. Then, a glint, a small metallic flash near Dresden's feet, something reflecting the light. It was fleeting, gone in an instant. But Leo caught it, something small silver. And, sharp, he zoomed in on the feed, enhancing the image. It was difficult to make out, obscured by the plush carpet and the angle of the camera. But there it was, forming a small, glinting object lying near Dresden's polished shoes. Something that hadn't been there a moment before. The enhanced image resolved itself on the monitor, the pixelated blur sharpening into a distinct form. Leo's breath hitched. It wasn't a dropped coin. It wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was a micro-laser sight, the kind favored by professionals. Small enough to be concealed in a watch, a pen, or even a ring. Deadly accurate, his instincts, dulled by months of routine, slammed awake. This wasn't a random act of aggression. This was a hit. And Dresden was the target. He zoomed out, scanning the Serpent's eye for potential shooters. The room was opulent, all dark wood and plush velvet designed to exude exclusivity. It also offered ample cover. A dozen places to conceal a weapon, a dozen escape routes. His gaze swept across the assembled guests, the high rollers, the social climbers, the hangers-on, all potential suspects. Then he saw it, a quick, almost imperceptible movement. A man standing near the bar, blending into the crowd, casually adjusting the sleeve of his expensive tailored jacket. A small, almost involuntary gesture. But Leo's training hadn't abandoned him entirely. He recognized it for what it was: subby, the subtle repositioning of a concealed weapon. The man wasn't looking at Dresden. He was looking through Dresden, assessing the angles, calculating the trajectory. Leo's hand instinctively moved towards the alarm button on the console. He hesitated. A gut feeling, icy and unwelcome, told him moving now, alerting everyone, would be a mistake. It would flush the shooter, potentially ruining any chance of identifying him. He needed a clear visual. He needed confirmation. He fought the urge to shout, to warn Dresden. He couldn't risk a false alarm. He needed proof. The weight of that decision settled on his chest, heavy and suffocating. And then, the shot rang out, a single, sharp crack that shattered the carefully constructed atmosphere of the Serpent's eye. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, diving for cover, glasses shattered. The band, mid-song, froze, their instruments falling silent. Dresden reacted with surprising speed. He dropped to the floor, rolling behind a large, ornate table. The bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and drawing a thin line of crimson. Not fatal, but enough to send a wave of panic through the room. Kovar, Dresden's head of security, was a whirlwind of motion. He barked orders, his voice cutting through the pandemonium, directing his team to secure the room. Bodyguards swarmed, scanning the crowd, weapons drawn. Leo's mind raced. His training took over, overriding the weariness, the disillusionment. He replayed the seconds leading up to the shot in his head, frame by frame. The man adjusting his sleeve, the slight shift in his weight, the way his eyes. Leo focused on the area where he'd last seen the shooter. The crowd was a churning mass of bodies, scrambling for safety. The man was gone. But Leo's mind had captured an image, a fleeting, fragmented snapshot. Dark hair, receding hairline, sharp jawline. A small, almost unnoticeable scar above his left eyebrow. And most importantly, his eyes cold, calculating. Empty, the kind of eyes that had seen too much, or had done too much. He had a face. A ghost of a face, but a face nonetheless. "Benny, we have a shooter," Leo barked into the comm. his voice tight with urgency. Male, dark hair, approximately 6 feet tall, slim build, scar above the left eyebrow. Last seen near the bar. Static crackled in his earpiece. Slow down, Leo. What are you talking about? We're getting conflicting reports. I saw him, Benny. He was prepping to fire before it happened. He was near the bar, adjusting his jacket sleeve. Get a description out to all security. Seal the exits. Hold your horses, Leo. Security is already securing the perimeter. We need to maintain order. No need to panic the guests. Benny's voice was infuriatingly calm, bureaucratic. Panic. A man just tried to finally assassinate Arthur Dresden. This isn't a spilled drink, Benny. This is a potential catastrophe. We're handling it, Leo. Just stay at your station and monitor the feeds. Leo clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream. He knew what bureaucratic inertia looked like. He'd seen it too many times. Time was slipping away. The shooter was likely already gone, lost in the maze of corridors and emergency exits. He strained his eyes, meticulously reviewing the security footage, rewinding and replaying the critical moments. He needed something, anything, that could help identify the shooter. A license plate number, a distinct piece of clothing, a recognizable face. And that is when he saw it. On one of the outer camera feeds, a blurry image of the shooter walking quickly towards an emergency exit. He was glancing back over his shoulder, and his eyes met Leo's, not at the camera, at Leo. A chilling realization washed over him. It wasn't a fleeting glance, it was recognition, a deliberate, predatory stare. The shooter hadn't been trying to blend into the crowd. He'd been watching him, knowing he was being watched. Leo's blood turned to ice. The static in his ears suddenly felt deafening. He wasn't just observing a crime, he was part of it. The taste of stale coffee clung to the back of Leo's throat, mirroring the bitterness settling in his gut. Benny's dismissal still stung, but it fueled a grim determination. If the Golden Mirage's security wasn't going to take the threat seriously, he would. He bypassed the official casino network, accessing restricted databases through a backdoor he'd built during a particularly dull stretch 6 months ago. He started with Arthur Dresden, feeding his name into every law enforcement and financial database he could reach. The initial results were predictably bland: real estate investments, charitable donations, a few minor traffic violations, all carefully curated, meticulously scrubbed. But as he dug deeper, cross-referencing names and shell corporations, a pattern began to emerge. A network of offshore accounts, connections to known figures in organized crime small. Time enforcers, mid-level smugglers, and whispers of something darker, something larger. Dresden wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a spider at the center of a vast, tangled web. The images flickered across his screen, triggering a cascade of unwelcome memories. Baltimore. The missing persons case. The businessman, Julian Vance, with his polished FA8 and hidden connections. Vance had also been careful, meticulous. He'd covered his tracks well, almost too well. Leo had sensed it then. The feeling of being manipulated, of chasing shadows, a flash of Sarah's face. Her optimistic smile before it all fell apart. Another rain-slick street, the acrid smell of gunpowder. That case had been different superficially. A missing heiress, but underneath the layers of privilege and deceit, it had shared the same chilling quality, a sense of orchestrated chaos, of hidden players pulling the strings. Attempts on Vance's life, dismissed as unrelated incidents, but Leo had suspected otherwise. Now, looking at Dresden's file, the parallels were unsettling. Too many coincidences. He rubbed his tired eyes. The grainy image of the scar above the shooter's eyebrow burned into his memory. He'd run the image through facial recognition software, but the results were inconclusive, too blurry. Not enough defining characteristics, looking for someone Leo. The voice startled him, and he nearly slammed his laptop shut. He swiveled in his chair to find a woman standing beside him, leaning against the console with an unnerving casualness. She was striking, with dark, intelligent eyes and a cascade of raven hair. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. He didn't recognize her. She wasn't on the casino's employee roster. "Who are you?" he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the security alert button. She smiled, a knowing, almost melancholic expression. Isabella Rossi, I'm a friend. A friend of who? Let's just say I'm a friend of discretion, and I've been watching you. Leo's jaw tightened. Watching me? What do you mean? You're a good observer, Leo Maxwell. You notice things others miss. That makes you interesting. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the monitors. You're digging into Arthur Dresden, aren't you? He didn't respond. He didn't need to. You're smart to be careful, Isabella continued, her voice low and melodic. Dresden is complicated. He has a long history. A history he'd prefer to keep buried. I'm starting to get that impression. He wasn't always Arthur Dresden, she said, as if revealing a dangerous secret. He used to be Alessandro Vitale, a name that might ring a bell if you've been following Italian organized crime for a while. Leo frowned. Vitale. The name sparked a distant memory. A decades-old scandal involving money laundering and political corruption. A case that had quietly disappeared from the headlines. Vitale was implicated in the Veronese affair, Isabella said. Anticipating his thought, a massive financial fraud that brought down several prominent politicians. He vanished before he could be brought to justice, changed his name, relocated to the States, and reinvented himself as Arthur Dresden. Why didn't this come up in the initial search? Leo asked, frustration lacing his voice. Because it was erased, covered up. Dresden has powerful friends, Leo. Friends who are very good at making problems disappear. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. You've stumbled into something dangerous. They are always watching. Before Leo could respond, Isabella reached into her handbag and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She slipped it into his hand, her fingers brushing against his. This contains information, untraceable files. It might help you understand what you're up against. Use it wisely. What is this? Insurance, Leo. And a warning. Be careful who you trust, and remember, some ghosts refuse to stay buried. She straightened, her eyes locking with his. There was a depth of sadness in her gaze, a haunting weariness that made him wonder what she'd seen, what she'd lost. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the casino's swirling crowd, leaving Leo alone with the weight of her words and the cold metal of the flash drive in his palm. He looked up at the security monitors, scanning the faces of the passing revelers. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That somewhere, hidden in the shadows, eyes were fixed on him. And then he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that the shooter hadn't just been looking he'd been sending a message, a warning. He wasn't just investigating a crime, he'd become a target. The encrypted files on the flash drive resisted his initial attempts at decryption. Isabella hadn't just provided information. She'd provided a puzzle, a test. Leo, however, hadn't earned his reputation by backing down from a challenge. He spent the next 4 hours hunched over his laptop, running a series of progressively complex decryption algorithms. The casino's New Year's Eve celebrations faded into background noise, a distant hum that couldn't penetrate his focus. Finally, with a satisfying click, the encryption yielded. A cascade of files spilled onto the screen. Fendi. A labyrinth of coded transactions, encrypted communications, and high-resolution surveillance photographs. It was a digital Pandora's box, and Leo was bracing himself for what might spill out. The transactions were dizzying. A complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts spanning multiple continents. Millions of dollars flowing in and out, laundered through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, art galleries, import-export companies, luxury hotels. Each transaction was meticulously documented, every movement traced. And at the center of it all, like a dark star, was Arthur Dresden, or rather, Alessandro Vitale. The surveillance photographs were even more revealing. Images of Dresden meeting with shadowy figures in secluded locations, Fidi Dre private yacht in Monaco, a clandestine casino in Macau, a secluded villa in the Italian countryside. Among them were recognizable faces, Thidian politicians, judges, police chiefs, all subtly compromised, all seemingly indebted to Vitale. It wasn't just a network of criminals. It was a systematic corruption of power, a rot that had spread through the very foundations of society. Leo traced one particular series of transactions leading to a prominent senator, Richard Harding, a man known for his staunch anti-crime stance. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Harding was receiving regular donations from a vital, controlled account, funds that conveniently coincided with key votes that benefited Dresden's business interests. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. The abuse of power, the insidious creep of corruption. But the scale of this operation, it was breathtakingly audacious. As he dug deeper, a chilling pattern emerged. The shooter, the man with a scar above his left eyebrow, wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger operation, a team of professionals dispatched to neutralize any threat to Dresden's empire. Leo found fragmented communications within the encrypted files, referring to the shooter as Silas and detailing his movements, his target, his contingency plans. It was a coordinated operation, meticulously planned and flawlessly executed, except it hadn't been flawless. Leo had seen Silas. He had a face, and someone wanted to make sure he stayed silent. Leo Maxwell, a voice boomed behind him. He swiveled in his chair to find Benny, accompanied by Marcus Thorne, the casino's head of security, thinny, a man built like a brick wall with a permanent scowl. "Mr. Thorne," Leo said, attempting a casual tone. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We've received some complaints," Thorne said, his voice gravelly, "concerning your activities bypassing security protocols, accessing restricted databases. I was investigating the incident in the Serpent's Eye," Leo explained, carefully choosing his words. "Trying to identify the shooter." Thorne's scowl deepened. "That is our job, Maxwell, not yours. You're a security observer, not an investigator, understand? With all due respect, I thought my observations were helpful. Your observations are causing unnecessary concern. You're stirring up trouble, and frankly, we don't appreciate it," Benny chimed in. "Consider this a warning, Leo. Stay in your lane, focus on your job, and leave the investigating to the professionals." The warning was a thinly veiled threat. Leo understood it perfectly. They were telling him to back off, to forget what he'd seen, to pretend it hadn't happened. He didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Thorne's impassive face. "Good," Thorne said. "I expect your full cooperation." He turned to Benny. "See to it." Thorne and Benny walked away, leaving Leo staring at the back of his monitor. He knew this wasn't over. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He glanced back at the decrypted files, the weight of the information pressing down on him. He had to get this information to the authorities. But who could he trust? The police? The FBI? They were likely compromised, infiltrated by Dresden's network. He initiated a secure file transfer, encrypting the data again, preparing to send it to an anonymous source he'd cultivated during his Baltimore days, Finney journalist known for her investigative prowess and unwavering integrity. He was just about to hit send when the screen flickered. The image froze. Then the lights flickered. A series of error messages flashed across the screen, followed by a stark, ominous warning: access denied. System compromised. Leo's blood ran cold. The casino's entire security system had been hacked. His access had been revoked. He was locked out, isolated. Vulnerable, he tried to reboot the system, but it was no use. The network was offline, completely and utterly shut down. As he stared at the blank screen, a chilling realization dawned upon him. He hadn't just stumbled into a conspiracy. He'd walked into a trap. And now, the walls were closing in. The casino had gone eerily quiet. The festive music had stopped, replaced by a low, unsettling hum. The shouts and laughter had died down, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath. Leo tried his cell phone. No signal. He tried the landline. Dead. The network was down, effectively cutting him off from the outside world. He was on his own. He tried to contact the local police. The call went straight to voicemail. He attempted to reach the FBI field office. Same result. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Dresden's influence extended far and wide. He'd neutralized any potential allies before they even knew there was a problem. He was a cornered animal. He moved quickly, abandoning the security console and heading for the nearest exit. He needed to get off casino property, to find a safe haven, to figure out his next move. He didn't make it far. As he turned a corner into a dimly lit service corridor, 3 figures materialized in front of him. Blocking his path, they were the same type of men he'd seen working security for Dresden, thick-necked, expressionless, radiating a cold professional menace. One of them, a hulking brute with a shaved head and a network of tattoos snaking across his arms, stepped forward. He cracked his knuckles. "Mr. Maxwell," he said, his voice a low growl. "We need to have a little chat." Leo sized them up, assessing his options. He was outnumbered and outmatched in terms of brute force, but he wasn't defenseless. Years on the force, years spent tracking down criminals, had honed his instincts. He still remembered how to handle himself. "I don't have time for chats," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "I need to leave," the tattooed man chuckled. "You're not going anywhere. We just want the flash drive." Leo's hand instinctively went towards his pocket, where he'd secured the small silver device. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play coy, Maxwell. We know about the files. We know what you found. Hand it over. And maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk away." "Maybe," Leo repeated, a sardonic edge to his voice. "That doesn't sound very reassuring." The tattooed man didn't respond. He simply nodded to his companions, and they advanced. Leo braced himself. He dropped into a fighting stance, his muscles coiled and ready. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged fight against three opponents. He needed to be quick, decisive, and ruthless. The first attacker lunged, throwing a wild haymaker. Leo ducked under the swing, twisting his body and delivering a sharp elbow to the attacker's ribs. The man grunted in pain and stumbled backward. He spun around, facing the second attacker, a wiry individual with a cold, calculating gaze. The man came at him with a knife, slashing towards his midsection. Leo reacted instinctively, parrying the blade with his forearm and delivering a swift kick to the attacker's knee. The man yelped and dropped to one knee. Clutching his leg, he turned to face the tattooed man, who was now advancing slowly, his eyes filled with rage. The brute swung a heavy punch, forcing Leo to backpedal. He dodged another blow, then another, using his agility to avoid the onslaught. The fight was brutal, a chaotic dance of fists and feet. Leo relied on his reflexes, his training, his sheer will to survive. He landed a series of quick jabs connecting with the tattooed man's face, but the brute barely flinched. He was wearing himself out. They were relentless. He felt a searing pain in his side. The wiry attacker, despite his injured knee, had managed to land a blow with the knife. He staggered backward, clutching his wound. He could feel the warm stickiness of blood soaking into his shirt. He was cornered, pinned against a stack of crates. The tattooed man loomed over him, his fists raised. This was it. "Any last words, Maxwell?" the brute sneered. Before Leo could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, tackling the tattooed man from behind. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the corridor as a security baton connected with the brute's skull. Leo blinked, momentarily stunned. He looked up and saw Isabella Rossi, her face grim, wielding the baton with surprising proficiency. "Get up, Maxwell," she shouted, expertly disarming the wiry attacker. "We need to go." She moved with a fluid grace, deflecting blows, delivering precise strikes. She was a surprisingly capable fighter, and for a moment Leo wondered who she really was. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side. Together, they fought their way through the remaining attackers, creating enough of a distraction to break free. They sprinted through the maze of back corridors, dodging obstacles, evading pursuit. Finally, they reached a rarely used service exit leading to a deserted loading dock. "This way," Isabella said, leading him towards a black SUV parked in the shadows. She opened the door, and Leo collapsed inside, gasping for breath. As she started the engine, she glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" Leo asked, his voice raspy. "Really?" Isabella didn't answer immediately. She put the car into gear and sped away from the Golden Mirage, leaving the chaos behind. "My name is Isabella Vatale," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "Arthur Dresden is my ex-husband, and I'm an investigative journalist. I've been digging into his activities for years." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "You stumbled into something much bigger than you realize, Leo. And now, we both have a target on our backs." The safe house was a nondescript bungalow hidden in a quiet residential neighborhood, miles from the glitz and glamour of the Strip. It smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. a stark contrast to the stale smoke and desperation of the Golden Mirage. Isabella had secured it through a network of contacts she declined to elaborate on, a world of shadows and whispers Leo hadn't known existed. Alessandro wasn't always a criminal mastermind. Isabella began pacing the small living room. He was a promising young accountant, working for a powerful Roman family. He discovered they were involved in a massive money laundering scheme, siphoning funds from the Vatican Bank. He tried to expose them, but they framed him, fabricated evidence, and drove him into exile. Leo listened intently, piecing together the fragments of information. So, Dresden's been building this empire to get revenge. Not exactly the initial plan was in revenge, but it evolved. He realized he could use the stolen money to create a new life, a new identity. He built a criminal empire, not just to avenge himself, but to amass power. And someone wants to stop him. That is why the hit, precisely. Someone within the Roman family or their allies is still after him. They feared he'd eventually reveal their involvement. They saw him as a loose end. They spent the next 24 hours dissecting the files from the flash drive, connecting the dots, building a solid case against Dresden and his network of corrupt officials. Isabella's investigative skills were exceptional, her ability to navigate the labyrinthine world of financial crime unparalleled. Leo's photographic memory proved invaluable, allowing him to recall minute details from the surveillance footage that Isabella had initially overlooked. Together, they were a formidable team. They identified a key figure, Victor Martel, a powerful casino owner with deep ties to organized crime and a long history of political influence in Las Vegas. Martel was the architect of the conspiracy, the man who had orchestrated Dresden's downfall decades ago and was now attempting to finish the job. Martel is untouchable, Isabella said. Reviewing the evidence, he has judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials in his pocket. Bringing him down won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Leo replied, a flicker of his old determination returning. Isabella had established contact with a sympathetic FBI agent. Agent Harding, in no relation to the compromised Senator Thuin, who agreed to provide discreet assistance, but warned them they would need irrefutable evidence to stand a chance against Martel. They decided to use a sting operation. Leo, using his security expertise, would infiltrate Martel's primary casino. The Colossus, gathering evidence of illegal activity, Isabella would focus on exposing Martel's financial connections. The operation was risky, but they had no other choice. The Colossus was everything the Golden Mirage was in Thuin: ostentatious, garish, and brimming with a barely concealed air of menace. Leo moved through the casino, posing as a security consultant, observing, recording, gathering evidence of illegal gambling, money laundering, and racketeering. Isabella worked from the shadows, leaking information to Agent Harding and the press. The pressure mounted. Martel, sensing that something was amiss, tightened security, making their operation increasingly dangerous. The final confrontation took place in Martel's penthouse suite, a lavish display of wealth and power. Leo and Isabella, accompanied by a team of FBI agents, stormed the suite, catching Martel and his bodyguards completely off guard. A brief but intense firefight ensued. Gunshots echoed through the opulent rooms. Martel's bodyguards were quickly subdued. Martel himself, however, proved to be more resourceful. Attempting to escape through a hidden passage, Leo pursued him, cornering him on the rooftop overlooking the glittering city. "It is over, Martel," Leo said, his voice cold and unwavering. "It is time to pay for your crimes." Martel sneered. "You think you've won, Maxwell. You have no idea what you've unleashed." The FBI agents swarmed the rooftop, securing the area. Martel didn't resist arrest. He knew he was beaten. As they led Martel away in handcuffs, Isabella approached Leo, a weary smile gracing her lips. "We did it," she said. "We finally did it." But Leo wasn't celebrating. He was staring at something he'd noticed on Martel. Suristuni, a small, silver bracelet engraved with a stylized serpent, coiled around a rose. He knew that symbol. It wasn't T connected to the Italian mafia or Martel S network. It was something else, something far more unsettling. It was the same symbol he'd seen in Baltimore, etched into the locket Sarah had been wearing the night she disappeared. The symbol of the organization behind her murder. The same organization he had been able to touch. A chill ran down his spine. He'd brought down a powerful criminal empire, but he had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The conspiracy ran deeper, the roots more tangled than he could have ever imagined. He turned to Isabella, his face pale. "This is over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is just getting started." The fallout from Martel's arrest was seismic. A cascade of indictments swept through Las Vegas, toppling corrupt officials and dismantling a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. Dresden, though implicated in numerous felonies, cooperated with the authorities, offering information in exchange for a reduced sentence. It wasn't a complete exoneration, but it was enough to ensure his safety and a lengthy, comfortable stay in a federal facility. The headlines screamed of justice served, of a city cleansed. But Leo knew the truth. They'd merely pruned a diseased branch. The roots remained hidden deep within the soil. He stood with Isabella on a quiet beach several states away, watching the waves crash against the shore. The air was clean and salty, a world away from the smoky haze of the casinos. "It is quiet," he said, surprised by the unfamiliarity of peace. Isabella smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "It is, for now." She'd offered him a job, a position within her organization, 40A Small. Independent investigative group dedicated to exposing corruption and fighting for justice. It wasn't the quiet life he'd envisioned, but it was a purpose. A way to use his skills, his instincts, to make a difference. "I accept," he'd said without hesitation. "Good," Isabella had replied. "We have a lot of work to do." He'd spent the last few weeks deconstructing his past, unpacking the trauma that had haunted him for years. With Isabella's encouragement, he started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in PTSD. It wasn't a quick fix and the nightmares still came, but he was learning to manage them, to process the grief and guilt that had consumed him for so long. He still thought about Sarah, a dull ache in his chest. But he was starting to remember her not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, intelligent woman who had loved life. He was learning to honor her memory, not by seeking vengeance, but by fighting for a world where tragedies like hers wouldn't happen. He'd started running again, pushing his body to its limits, finding solace in the rhythm of his footsteps. He'd even taken up painting, experimenting with abstract landscapes, attempting to translate the chaos within into something beautiful. "You're different," Isabella said, breaking the silence. "You seem lighter." Leo shrugged. "Maybe I am. It is still a work in progress." "It always will be," she said, her voice gentle. "But you're facing your demons. That is all that matters." He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. He hadn't allowed himself to get close to anyone since Sarah, but with Isabella, it felt different. She understood him, not just his darkness, but his potential for light. They walked along the beach in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of the waves washing away their anxieties. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Leo's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from Isabella, but it wasn't. It was an anonymous text containing a single image. His blood ran cold. It was a photograph, a grainy black and white photograph depicting a small, dilapidated church in a forgotten corner of Baltimore. A church he'd visited countless times during his investigation into Sarah's disappearance. And prominently displayed above the door, barely visible in the shadows, was the same stylized serpent coiled around a rose. The symbol he thought he'd left behind in Baltimore. He stared at the image, his mind reeling. Someone was watching him. Someone knew about his past. Someone was sending him a message. He showed the image to Isabella, his hand trembling. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Leo didn't answer immediately. He felt a familiar dread creep into his soul, a chilling premonition of danger he knew, with a sickening certainty that the people behind Sarah's murder were still out there. They hadn't been brought to justice. They hadn't been exposed, they were simply lying in wait, patiently biding their time. It means, he said finally, his voice grim, that the long shadow hasn't disappeared, it has just grown longer.